Hello, my loves, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds. Now, I feel moved to just turn on the microphone and start wittering away about nonsense, to be perfectly honest. It's been owing to various different factors, working in the COVID-19 situation and working in care, which is not at the very forefront of it, but is certainly in the front ranks. Can be very harrowing and can be rather distressing, and we've been dealing with a bit of that this week. So it's just been, for me, it's just been a deep dive into any kind of media I can find that provides some, not just release. I mean, I've spoken before on Strange Playgrounds about what I think of the notion of escapism in fiction and literature and art, and I think it's bullshit. I even when you actively seek it out, you won't find it. What art and literature and fiction and media in general allows you to do is not escape what you're experiencing, but to process it. That's what it's for. That's what it does. It allows for arenas where things can be experienced and doped out and explored metaphorically and in abstract terms, in the same way that dreaming does. That's what dreams are for. That's essentially what media is, what art is, what stories are. It's dreaming while awake. And that's true of any media. And that's when it's at its best for me. That when it reaches that point, when it realizes that that's what it's doing and it just goes for it, that is when it's at its best and at its most earnest, you know? I really appreciate fiction that does that. I mean, at the moment I'm reading so much. I'm just like, I've gotten more done, despite the fact that we are more busy at the moment than almost anyone else on the planet because of COVID-19. I've gotten more reading done in the months and weeks since COVID-19 hit our shores than I probably have in the last decade. I've just done so much reading. I've been revisiting old favourites. I've been reading new stuff. I mean, at the moment I'm reading Look Homeward Angel by Thomas Wolfe, which I'm really enjoying. I've been reading a lot of classic fiction. I read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which is incredible fun. I never liked that one as a child. I did try to read it as a child and I couldn't get on with it, but reading it as an adult I actually really enjoyed. I like the rip-roaring adventure quality of it. And yeah, you have to deal with certain things because it's a Victorian book and it's a Victorian English novel, so it has a certain imperialism about it, which if you want to appreciate the book, you've got to acknowledge and get over, you know? But in terms of the qualities it possesses that I really like, one of them is that it is just this rip-roaring adventure that just goes. I think a lot of people who've never seen it or have just seen the films of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, they tend to just think that it's about the giant squid and that it's about the deep dive into the unknown, into the ocean. It's not. That's only one part of it. It's one very small part of it, but that's the iconic part. In 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the crew of the Nautilus, they go all over the world. You know, it's a bit like Willy Fogg. You know, they go all over the world, and it's quite fun. It's a lot of fun in that regard. I reread Alice in Wonderland, both books, Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass, both of which are absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. So it was some of my favourite books in all the world, which I think anyone who's read my fiction can tell. There's a big influence of Alice in Wonderland in my fiction. What I like about Alice in Wonderland more than anything is that it is largely plotless. Despite what most of the adaptations try to sort of foist upon it and sort of mold it to be, it's not a plot or narrative driven book. There's hardly any plot or narrative to speak of, to be perfectly honest. It's about the moments. It's just about these very strange images and moments and experiences that Alice has and that the characters around her have, which are often rendered in very poetic terms, literally in poetic terms in many respects. You know, a lot of the characters occur through poetry, like the Walrus and the Carpenter, for example, or the Jabberwocky. The Jabberwocky occurs in a poem, obviously. It's really cool. I love those books to bits. I like how they, sort of what we were talking about earlier, where fiction acknowledges that it is essentially dreaming whilst awake. Well, Alice in Wonderland is that and then some. Alice in Wonderland is just, it's a dream. It is literally a dream within the context of the story. Wonderland is essentially Alice's psychological scape. That's what it is. She's daydreaming rather than attending to her lessons. That's what it's about, you know. She finds her own internal world more fascinating than the external world, which she actually finds rather boring. And I like that. I really like that. A lot of writers, a lot of fantasy writers have picked that up and run with it. Clive Barker, which, you know, anyone who's listened to this channel for any length of time will know is sort of an idol of mine. Oh, God, yeah, Clive runs with it. Clive has taken that on board and has just gone with it in almost every book he's ever written. Neil Gaiman does it a lot. If you read Neverwhere, for example, Neverwhere is very much that. It is very much a statement, an almost manifesto on the fact that actually our internal worlds are often much more interesting, much more various and fascinating than the external. And in order to know oneself, to have any kind of relationship with oneself, one needs to explore those things. They need to explore those factors. All of us have it. All of us have these internal landscapes, whether they're visually realized or not. But the sad fact of the matter is we are ridiculed out of exploring them when we're children. When we reach boys in particular, when we reach a particular age, we are told that certain things are childish, that we need to put them down, that the arena of the adult is this cold, soulless, vacuous, entirely pragmatic void of learning functional things. And that's it. As though the artistic, as though the abstract has no place at all. And what that results in, as we know, is what would be considered epidemics, were they bacterial or virological diseases rather than mental ones, yeah? So we've got in this country in particular, and in the US, and in most of the Western world actually, epidemics of male self-harm, depression and suicide. And the reasons for that are very complex, but I do think one of the reasons is we are ridiculed and often traumatized out of natural explorations of learning who we are and learning how to relate to ourselves. We are not even given the tools to do so. When we go to school, for example, we are not enjoined to imagine outside of particular parameters. We are never given the opportunity to just sit, close our eyes, and to explore what we are inside and how our minds work, you know, what shape they take, how thoughts occur, because they are different from person to person. Every human being is basically their own little psychological phenomena, as Jung well put it, you know. I'm not entirely a Jungian, but I'm more of a Jungian than I am a Freudian, you know. I think Jung had some very strange ideas. He had some very, very strange ideas. But I think one of the ones that I absolutely abide by is his notion that you can't apply prescribed templates to human psychology. We are phenomena in and of ourselves, and in order to understand ourselves, we need to acknowledge that and explore it. We need to be given the means to explore it, which we're not. A lot of people, particularly in the UK, in this culture, we grow up without any relation to ourselves. We don't learn how to communicate with ourselves. We're ridiculed out of talking to ourselves. We're told that it's the reserve of crazy people, or it's deviant, or there's something strange about it. How can you learn to communicate with yourself unless you talk to yourself? You know, either internally or externally. I will never ridicule anyone for talking to themselves. Ever, ever, ever. I think it's essential. I think it's absolutely essential. I will never ridicule anyone for playing games like they used to as children, you know, where you would imagine scenarios and you would sort of act them out with action figures or whatever. I will never ridicule anyone for that because I think it's actually a very healthy thing to do. As anyone who even dips toe into present-day psychology will tell you, it is a healthy thing to do. It's just something that we're ridiculed out of. So we learn to become calcified. We learn to become alien to who we are, to ourselves, and that results in an inability to communicate, to relate to other human beings. We become stunted on so many other levels, on the romantic, in the imaginative, in the interpersonal. It's so sad. It's so sad. We become these closed-off, fossilized creatures that actually learn to enshrine that status, to enshrine the sickness, as though it's desirable, because that's what culture enjoins us to do, you know? It's like worshipping your cancer. It's like saying that your cancer is God or that your cancer loves you. which is very much like nationalism for me. Nationalism is very much the same. Proclaiming to love your country is like proclaiming to love cancer, insofar as I'm concerned. It's an absurd status, but that, I think, is a subject for another video. What I love about fiction is every time I engage with a book, every time I engage with a story in any medium, whether it's video games, whether it's literature, whether it's fiction, I see myself. I think we all do. They are reflections back of who we are. Anyone who studied critical theory to any degree, who knows things, who knows the theories of critical theory, like post-structuralism, Freudian theory, Marxist theory, postmodern theory, modern theory, all that stuff. You learn that meaning and significance in art is not inherent to the text. It's an actually much more fluid and malleable thing, which is born on the interplay of audience and text. It's born on the interaction between those two elements, and relies as much on what the reader brings to the text as whatever is inherent to the text itself. All the text really does is provides the arena. It provides the boundaries and the setting by which that exploration can occur. It's why people come away from texts in particular with drastically different interpretations, because they bring their biases to it, their intentions, they consciously or unconsciously. It's why some people can come away from a particular text declaiming it as immoral, as monstrous, whereas others say, no, it's ascended, it's humanist, it's beautiful. Both are true. Both can be true simultaneously. That's something that doesn't chime very well with present-day culture, because present-day culture prescribes simplicity. It wants everything to be absolute. It wants people to be either saintly or infernal. It wants political systems to either be absolute or absolute trash. There's one way and that's it. There is gospel and that's it. There is orthodoxy, and that's it. And that's a real shame. You lose nuance in that regard. You lose nuance. It's also true, obviously, as we've discussed and explored many, many times before, it's obviously true that texts can be simultaneously immoral in many, many ways, and also worthwhile. Yeah? Authors can be very immoral, very awful people, and yet produce beautiful things. As we've mentioned many, many times before, the text is often wiser than the man. Yeah, the text is often wiser than the creator. That's true in so many ways. I mean, I'm not a fan of Ender's Game myself. I'm really not. I think you have to have grown up with it to get any relevance out of it. Coming to it as an adult, it doesn't really work for me. But there are elements of it that I think are laudable, There are certain elements of it that are laudable, even though Orson Scott Card is obviously a terrible man. H.P. Lovecraft's work, the classic example, H.P. Lovecraft himself was just awful. I mean, he was a terrible man, very damaged, broken man, and brought that to his writing. So a lot of his writing is an expression of being damaged and broken, but there's also beautiful stuff in it. In fact, some of the stuff that is an expression of his being damaged and broken is in and of itself kind of beautiful, in the sense that he's trying to use it to express and work through these issues. I mean, not always. Sometimes he's done exactly what I talked about before. He's enshrined his own sickness and is extolling it, so the racism, the anti-Semitism, all that kind of thing, which derives from a more general fear of humanity in Lovecraft. He's just afraid of everything. I mean, as you can see in his writing, it comes through very clearly. He's a very fearful, frightened man. He's afraid of everything. And the same, I imagine, is true of Orson Scott Card. I mean, not to in any way to apologise for his awful behaviour, and the man is awful. I mean, he's a terrible, terrible human being. But I do imagine informing most of it is this terrible, crippling anxiety and fear, as there often is. It's that sense that the world is slipping, that the world we want or the world we know, or assume to know, is somehow fading away around us or is being eroded around us. That can so often lead to prejudice. It can so often lead to bigotry, because that's kind of how we react. It does seem to be something human beings do. The bigotry and the prejudice, whatever form it takes, is the narrative that accrues. It's the justification for the way we feel, and it's a way of it's a way of expressing our own powerlessness and focusing it on a scapegoat. It's a way of defining it because it's this group's fault or that tribe's fault, which makes it easier to deal with than if it's actually systemic and therefore massive and abstract and historical and very difficult to undo, very difficult to deal with. It absolves us of responsibility as well. That's another thing scapegoating does. It just absolves us of responsibility for tackling the issue in any real way. It's because it's an easy answer. It's their fault. It's that fault. It's exactly the same psychology that informs the scapegoating of video games, of movies, of media for atrocities, whenever there's a school shooting, whenever there's a murder, whenever there's this, there's that, the media in particular leap to scapegoating because the news media is cynical. News media is really cynical. It's the dark side of narrative. The people creating it know full well how narrative works and how humanity works and how we crave narrative simplicity and justification for very complex matters, and so they feed us that. They feed us that so that we will clamour for their input, so that we will elevate them and maintain them on their pedestals, where they don't deserve it at all. It's an easy answer, and most people will go for the easy answer rather than the big, complex one. And the big, complex answers are themselves often not answers at all. They're often just heaps of more questions, which, again, people don't like. People really hate the answer, I don't know. Maybe nobody knows, but it's true. It's true. I think it's true of most of human experience. Most things are more complex than most people want to believe. It's why you get incredible backlash when you have conversations like this from people who revere the simplicity or who want things to be simple. You will be told that you're reading too much into things. You will be told that you're complexifying or abstracting in a synthetic way or in an illegitimate way, as though this complexity is not there inherent to every aspect of human experience, which it is. It absolutely is. Even things that seem absolutely solid are not. Things that people would consider to be objective. This table is made out of wood. Well, kind of. But then you look at quantum mechanics and you learn that actually this table and everything around it is in constant motion and liable to change by being observed, by a sentient entity. It's much more complex. Everything is much more complex. Even objective or physical or seemingly absolutely true things are phenomenally more complex than we often allow ourselves to preconceive or grapple with, because the answers we come away with are often not answers. They are often further complexities and further mysteries. And that, sadly, insofar as I'm concerned, it seems to be the only absolute. It seems to be the way the world works, It certainly seems to be the way human abstraction works, our operation in the abstract or the metaphorical, the metaphysical, if you like, which is my arena. That's where I operate more than anything. It's why I've been reading the way I have. Another thing I picked up recently to reread, The Wind in the Willows. The Wind in the Willows are just such a beautiful book. It's so pretty. I think a lot of people are surprised. People who have only seen the cartoons or like the adaptations are really surprised when they come to Wind in the Willows, because it's so serene and quiet and beautiful, and it's all about these very positive male relationships. You don't see this in fiction very often, certainly not fiction that is aimed at boys, which this is. It's absolutely a boys' book, There's hardly any female characters in it, There's just hardly any. And those that do occur are often tertiary. They're kind of shunted off to the side. It's a book about male relationships, and they're often so beautiful in this book, so breezy and so unconcerned. They're so lacking in fragility. The relationship between rat and mole, for example, it's this bizarre domestic relationship where they live together, they do pretty much everything together. It's very, very affectionate. It's often physically affectionate. They often hold one another's hands. They often hug one another. They are very intimate together. It's a homo-domestic relationship that they enjoy, and it's effortless. It's completely effortless. It's unconcerned with everything around it. They do not care about any wider principle or concern or judgment. It's their life and it's the way they interact. And I love that. I absolutely love it. It's a very positive male relationship. And it's something that occurs all the way through. I mean, even their relationships with Toad. And Toad is an enormously problematic individual. He's got lots of problems, has Toad of Toad Hall. He has a kind of he's a character who would certainly be described as having ADHD in modern parlance. He doesn't have any easy focus. He shifts from one obsession to the other, and he's also very compulsive. You know, when he arrives at a new compulsion or a new obsession, he just throws himself into it. He starts to identify by it and throws away whatever the old obsessions were. He even demonizes them. You know, he calls them silly and stupid and small-minded. He has these epiphanic moments where when he experiences or encounters what's going to be the object of his new obsession, whether it's boats, whether it's like camping, whether it's motor cars, he effloresces and becomes like, he has this kind of universal, transcendental connection to everything, and that's how he experiences the world. The problem with that is that he becomes obsessive and doesn't necessarily consider consequence or the wider world around him. Everything is about this and about the experience, and that makes him enormously problematic. But his friends still abide by him. They don't reject him. They understand him. They understand who he is, and they just let him get on with it. You know, they do intervene when it becomes dangerous to him. They try to help, but it's always affectionate. It's always well-meaning. No matter how obnoxious Toad gets, and he does. Toad is kind of obnoxious, you know. And I love the relationships. I love them to bits. I also love, and this is something I think that surprises people when they come back to read it, the metaphysics. There's incredible metaphysics in this book. The animals live in this deity and spirit and demon haunted world, where there are characters like Pan, for example, where everything is pantheistic. There are elemental entities of the river and of the forest and of the wood, and they're very subtle, they're very in the background, but they do occur. It's really beautiful. It's really beautiful. Like when Mole goes missing in the wildwood and Ratty goes finding him, he's guided by the spirit of Pan. That's where the title comes from. There's a beautiful sort of song that Pan sings to lead Ratty to Mole, and he says it sounds like the wind through the reeds and willows. He forgets the song after a while, and he says, all I can remember is the sound of the wind through the reeds and willows, and it's absolutely beautiful. I mean, it's a beautiful moment. There's a lot going on under the surface of Wind in the Willows. It's not just a sort of jaunty book about anthropomorphic animals. There's a metaphysics at work here. It's like the characters are going through states of humanity or states of life, and they all represent particular states of life. And there's a dealing with death. You know, there is a dealing with death in this book, which a lot of the very best children's books do try to deal with in a very meaningful and real manner, and this one does. It's really pretty. It's really pretty. It's been a salve, The Wind in the Willows. It's been a salve. It is sort of, I've been able to open it up and just lose myself in its music and its cadence, and ironically the rhythm and the ethos of the story, of the prose, matches the languidness of its subject. So it is like Ratty and Mole just drifting on a little rowboat on the river. You know, it's pretty, it's beautiful, and I love it to bits. It's one of my favourites, I've got to say. It's one of my childhood favourites. I love Wind in the Willows to absolute abandon. I really do.